Yeah, that's fair. What I kind of wanted to cover in various forms this evening is the idea of strategy analysis and where that fits in. So you would have seen in the ebook, and you would have seen on the video and the readings, the key question from my perspective that we're thinking about is it's trying to determine a couple of things. It's how does our business make money? And what's the likelihood of that happening in the future? So that's kind of the big picture. The more detailed picture is if we're thinking about how does the business make money, we can normally divide that into, well, what industry or industries are we operating in? What are they like? And within the industries, how's our business positioned? What's its corporate or competitive strategy within an industry? As we're thinking about those questions, a key consideration is going to be, so how would industry conditions and corporate or competitive strategy be reflected in the financial statements that I see? And so we'll be thinking about some of that as we go through a few things this evening. So it's really, so how does it make things look? Should it be, as I said last week, I think when I say how does it get reflected in the financial statements, I'm thinking about, would I expect high or low profit margins? Would I expect high or low turnover? Would I expect high investment in non-current assets? Would I expect a large amount of intangible assets? These sorts of questions is what I mean by what do the financial statements look like? And really that's getting us to think about the question layered on top of all of that is, and how would that change in the future? So how is that likely to change? So that's kind of really the overview. You've all done a strategy course, correct? Yeah. So it's kind of, it's pick and choose the strategy analysis tools that you think are going to best describe your company as really what the task for the project is going to be. I'm not too fussed whether you choose method A versus method B, as long as you think about what are the industry conditions like, what's the firm's positioning like, and how does that likely to be reflected in the financials. So don't feel obliged to do Porter's 5 forces if you don't think that's applicable. Don't be obliged to do a value chain analysis if you don't think that's likely to be helpful. Don't do economics attributes if you don't think that's like. So pick and choose whichever ones whichever ones you think are likely to be most helpful. What I will be interested in your feedback is, and I kind of ask this all the time, is when we're thinking about competitive strategy, as in within industry, so how's our business positioned? A common way of thinking about it is we break things up into cost leadership and product differentiation, and we can think about those differences. So I'm always asking, so what's the latest in strategy analysis that is different to that? How should we think about industry or competitive positioning that we can't really, is not really just a rejigging of cost leadership versus differentiation? As I said, you're more up to date on the latest strategy research than I am, so fill me in.
So are you able to just clarify the question?
Sure.
So we're just asking, is there a better overlay to
what other ways have you been exposed to that you've found helpful in thinking about how a business, so if we think about, say, JB Hi-Fi, for example, I can think, okay, one of the things I know that JB Hi-Fi does is try and compete relatively heavily on price. They've kind of like view themselves as a low-cost provider and so on. Do they have any product differentiation? Well, the customer service, if you like, they have got a kind of a brand name, but often that the brand name is around, I guess, low price and service. So I'm thinking, so what else is there other than this thinking about things in terms of cost leadership and differentiation? So what other tools were you?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. So things like your business model canvas are going to be a great way of kind of capturing that holistic business and then identifying how the key value propositions might be differed from competitors. So still ties into that kind of competitive differentiation,
Sure.
but more broadly in the context of how does that relate to your income streams compared to your expenses, compared to key partners and the thing. So that's one way of looking at it.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Brad. Anyone else?
As well as the
Yeah.
value proposition approach, that just simple things like using a SWOT to pull together a few things like a pestle or an economic analysis. You can kind of group them through a SWOT and using multiple tools in one.
Sure. Yeah, and look, and we've got, so I guess there's this combination of thinking about industry or industries and then thinking about the way the firm's pitched within the industry, and so things like a five forces and value chain tend to be on industry. We can think about economic analysis kind of at industry too, or as it relates to a firm. SWOT, the consultants tend to use that more at a firm rather than industry because it's picking up on the competitive positioning within industry. Sure. Who else was going to jump in? Someone?
I was just going to say there was the industry decline, like the wider things that are happening in the market, like substitution of products.
Yeah, and that's so I guess, so you've picked up on, I guess, two things that were in the materials there that are potentially relevant, which is one, industry life cycle. And that was something that you would have seen, if I can just, let me just do a quick share. I will get up, where did I put my, show, sorry, my Zoom's not letting me, let me not share that. Let me just go back and see, because I'm running two monitors here. Oh, sort of two monitors, but they're meant to be joined. For some reason, it wasn't letting me pick up one of the, okay, here it is. Yeah, I need to drag it across onto the other monitor. Who knew? Okay, so we've got, let me just make this a little bit larger so we can see this. Okay, so this is something that we'll come back to over the course of the term, this type of life cycle, and we can think about this both at a firm level and also an industry level. So we've got industry factors or an industry life cycle, sort of start, growth, mature, decline, and we've got firm life cycle within the industry. So they're obviously related, but they're two separate things. And I guess further, if we're thinking about factors that influence performance, you've got firm specific stuff, you've got industry stuff, and you've also got the macroeconomic factors as well. And so part of what we'll be thinking about, particularly when we get to assessing performance metrics and also forecasting, is the impact of these factors, this corporate life cycle on those factors, because we'll expect different margins. We might expect different things on, say, the cash flow statement for a young growing firm in a growing industry than a mature firm in a mature or declining industry. One of the things that I'll throw up on the resources, if it's particularly when we get towards the ratio area, is that it can be difficult to know what its typical or standard ratios. Now, there's a good document that got released 2 years ago, and they were meant to release it last year, that gives us benchmarks for a whole bunch of standard ratios that we might be interested in looking at, sorted by both industry and by firm size. So I'll make sure I pop that up. I think those of you that were in the core accounting last year I think I may have shown you that document as well for one of our weeks there. But that just gives you a sense of what to expect as we kind of partition by industry and size. One of the things that I did want to mention, and this got brought up in some of the discussion that we're having on the forum, is we talk about industry and it kind of sounds all easy to work out what industry, but sometimes industry can be tricky. And it's kind of the two issues where industry can be tricky is, one, our firm does a number of things that isn't nicely captured in one industry. And so that's I guess problem number one. Which industry do I go into, and then what's the appropriate kind of peer group of measurement? So part of that is I popped a link up to this kind of what we'll call the GIC structure. Let me just share that with you. Did everyone see that at some point in either in the forums or the links, that spreadsheet? Yeah, or a document. I've got that up in the week 2 forum. Let me just share this so I can show you what I'm talking about. Okay, let me make that a little bit larger as well. Let's go down to, I don't know, I'm going to go down towards retailing because, okay. I've got, going from left to right, if we can see this, I've got the sector is what's described as the 2-digit industry. So this is consumer discretionary is what we've got here. And then consumer discretionary is then broken down into more parts. So I've got automobiles, so auto components, auto manufacturers, then I've got household durables. Okay, they would seem to be quite different things in terms of business models to me. Household durables, leisure products, then I've got consumer services. So casinos and gaming, hotels, resorts and cruise lines, leisure facilities, again, seems quite different than motorcycle manufacturers. Then I've got retailing and a whole bunch of different retailers. So if I'm thinking about, say, JB Hi-Fi, I'm probably going to be capturing this in, amongst other things, I've got computer and electronics retailer, a little bit of kind of some home improvement stuff is going to be there. And let me just sort of stop it. And probably if I go back up, in household durables, it's going to be, yeah, where's the consumer electronics retailing? That's going to be somewhere in there. Yeah, consumer electronics, yeah, home improvement. There's household appliances, home furnishing retailer would be another one. So a number of different industries. And as we go sort of 2-digit, 4-digit, 6-digit, 8-digit, we get a more refined measure of industry. So one of the things that you'll be thinking about when it comes to doing a comparison or thinking about industry is, at what level of granularity do I need to do? And particularly when you start thinking about the ratios, there's a trade-off that you're going to make. And as we go kind of 2-digit, 4-digit, 6-digit, 8-digit, pros and cons. The kind of one of the pros I just outlined, you're more likely to get a grouping that is a good match for what your organization is doing. What do you think is a potential downside of that process if I'm thinking about kind of looking for comparisons?
It's too narrow, so you're only looking at a very, very narrow piece of the market.
Yeah, so it might be, it's depending on how far down I go, it might go too narrow for what my organization actually does. So that's one problem. Another potential problem or issue that we might face?
The refined industry might not the main profitable sector or segment the company is.
Yeah, it might not be the main thing that the company's doing. I think that's yeah, so it could be, if the more detail we get, the less applicable it might be to a business that's doing something fairly broad. I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is, if in terms of comparison companies, our number of comparison companies gets smaller the further to the right we go. okay, in that chart. So the more refined our industry measure is, the less number of companies we have to compare. Does that proposition make sense? And we can quickly see that if you kind of go to, if we go to our library databases and we look at, say we look at data analysis, if I get that up. Has everyone managed to get FactSet access while I sort of think about database? Is anyone, that all yes, all got FactSet? Okay.
Not yet, but I've requested it.
Oh, okay. How long ago did you request it, Anne? Because
Last week.
okay, let me know if it's not through kind of maybe end of tomorrow or Thursday, and I'll chase them because they're not around. They're normally pretty good at chasing. I know they say 7 to 10 days on their website, but they're normally faster than that. So what I mean by a quick way of showing you is, again, you can follow along on data analysis if need be. If I'm looking at, so I'm on data analysis now, and I'm going to look at this search tool. And let me just look at financial search. So I'm picking up search tool up the top, financial search. I'm going to click on that. And over on this left in the section A, I'm going to pick on listed companies, ASX, and here's where I can select industry. So if I select, I saw that JB Hi-Fi was in retailing, which is in consumer discretionary. Let's just look at consumer discretionary, and let's just say that I want only firms in consumer discretionary that have revenue greater than, let's say $10 million. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So I'll put the operating revenue greater than $10 million. Let's add that as a query. And then I'll hit search. Okay, the point of this exercise is to show you that I've got 124 companies that meet that criteria. So keep that number in mind, 124. Now I'm going to edit the search. The only thing I'm going to do now is say within consumer discretionary, I'll now pick on retailing. Let's do the same search. And now I'm down to 51. So I've gone from 124 to 51 by narrowing down that industry. Then I'm going to click on edit search again, and I'm now going to click on specialty retailer, which is where JB Hi-Fi comes in. I'm going to click search again and do this. Now I'm down to 29, and we can see those 29 here. So the number of firms becomes lower, the kind of the tighter your industry definition is likely to be. But I don't know, I don't expect you to know all of these organizations, but there are kind of, you can have a look through and say, well, I know what JB Hi-Fi does, but I'm guessing that Autosports Group, or if you know Best and Less, is a bit different to JB Hi-Fi, and Baby Bunting is a bit different to JB Hi-Fi. And you could probably guess the Motorcycle Holdings is likely to, Beacon Lighting is a bit different, and Shaver Shop is a bit different. So even within a small group, we're still not dealing with organizations doing exactly the same thing. So one of your tasks as an analyst is to work out what's going to make a good comparison. The smaller the comparison group, the more likely you run into the problem that your comparison group may have been affected by something one-off in one of your comparison years, and that's going to distort relative perceived performance versus a broader group where that's less likely to be the case. So I said in the project, one of the things that you'd be wanting to do is say, look, here is how I've tried to deal with coming up with a comparison group that that's trying to let me show you how the performance of my organization has been relative to similar organizations. This doesn't get around the problem of, say, in Australia, or Wesfarmers, or as sort of Tom was picking at Disney, which is, so Wesfarmers is involved. It owns Bunnings, it owns Office, Kmart, it owns a bunch of insurance, it owns resources. It's really hard to pick it kind of does everything. One way of dealing with that is to say, well, look, I'll focus in an industry analysis on the key industries, and I'll typically base that off something like segment revenue. Segment disclosures you're going to get in the annual report. Thoughts, questions, comments on industry analysis?
Are there other things where you, so for example, with the retailing one, the way that a bricks and mortar retailer compared to an online retailer are going to operate very differently, and there's going to be different businesses that are different portions of each, but something that is almost purely online compared to something that does have that kind of bricks and mortar piece is going to be quite different. Do you want those sort of lenses overlaid to highlight the differences, or is that kind of going too much detail than is actually necessary for the purpose of this exercise?
Oh, look, just for the shorthanding that you've got coming up for the individual, that can be the sort of thing that you can mention when it comes to looking at the actual numbers for the full report, Braden. That's the type of thing you might say, look, one of the things that so where might that play out? Because that's a good example. An online retailer versus a bricks and mortar retailer. So the online retailer is likely to have more or less where might we expect to see that in the financial statements?
The way they manage their inventory might be quite different.
It's quite possible that they'll have less inventory on hand and less inventory storage. Yeah, so I might expect to see less inventory in the balance sheet at end of year. Yep, that might be one. What about the actual stores? Where do they typically appear in the financial statements? This is anyone, not just Braden.
Fixed assets.
Yes, that's likely to be fixed assets. Now, so the property, plant and equipment side of your balance sheet. And so does JB Hi-Fi own all of their store locations? Yeah, probably not. What do?
Lease.
They lease or rent them. Yeah. The accounting rules, we'll explore this in more detail next week. But by and large, the accounting rules try and treat as the same leased stores and owned stores for the purposes of where it appears on the balance sheet. So it still appears as property, plant and equipment. But yeah, so that will be one example of a difference that we would expect to see. Yeah. So in terms of describing the industry and the conditions, you probably don't need to get too much into that at the moment, Braden, other than you might want to say some organizations are predominantly online, some are omni-channel or multi-channel and do both. Mitch?
Just a quick one back to your comment about if there's multiple industry codes that's applicable to your company.
Yeah.
What sort of ratio, and I think you suggested using the segment analysis, what sort of ratios could you use of just revenue?
Yeah, what I was suggesting there is that if you have a look at the revenues and you work at, okay, so my 2 or 3 biggest revenue categories are sort of industry 1, industry 2, industry 3. And you could say something like, and they make up 60, 70, 80, 90% of overall group revenue. And so because you don't want to do an industry analysis on everything, then it's quite reasonable to say, look, I'm going to focus on these 2 industries because they make up a significant proportion. 70, 80, not whatever it happens to be, or I'll focus on these 2, which are the big ones. Reader, pay attention. They're also involved in the other games, but together that only makes up 10 or 15%. So I'm not going to do an analysis of there, but you could even do like a 1 or 2 sentence thrower. Like, I would expect the growth and profitability of these segments to be broadly similar, different to the primary segments, maybe because they are growing more, growing the same, growing less, something, but just a kind of a short reader, pay attention. I'm not covering everything because it's not practical to do so. And here's where it might kind of introduce some noise into the analysis, because it's not plausible for you to say to do an industry deep dive on everything. So you just want to say, look, here's what I believe is important. Here's why. And as a 1 sentence, here's what we might be missing in that analysis. Does that kind of cover it?
Yeah, that's fine. I understand it. Yep.
Yeah, Koshar.
My question is related to that, Jeff. So if I'm picking a company, so first example would be that a lot of Australian businesses are owned by, like, for example, Bunnings is owned by, Wesfarmers, so diversified groups, holdings.
Yes.
Is that viable? And B, if I were to pick an insurance company, and that was the reason why I went with the 6-digit codes, not the 8 one, because if I'm going to select QBE, they have, life insurance, but they also have like home insurance and car insurance. So then it goes into different sub-industries. So what's your sort of advice?
Oh, yeah. So can you pick something that covers multiple industries? Yes, you can. There's no restriction on that. You wouldn't be able to do Bunnings if you wanted to do Bunnings as a retailer, because it's not a standalone listed company. You'd need to do Wesfarmers, which is kind of hard.
Yeah.
But back to your question, yeah, I kind of picked on 6-digit for the kind of our week 2 discussion forum thing, but for your purposes for that project submission, I haven't specified how broad or narrow that industry is. So what I really want you to do is describe the industry that your firm is operating in, or industries that are the main ones. I guess the other one, and this is kind of linking your question with Mitch's question before, is to what extent do you think the business model is likely to change, and is your organization likely to move into a new industry, and will that become important, or is that happening? So that's the other thing to consider, because kind of a lot of our, like the 5 forces stuff tends to be kind of more a snapshot, but really what I want you thinking about is how's that likely to change. But yeah, if you want to do industry, yeah, I'm not forcing you to pick a 2, 4, 6 or 8-digit industry. You want to say, look, QBE operates in the following lines of business, following lines of insurance. I'll tell you a little bit about those particular industries and go from there. So again, you don't need to tell me about stuff that's not relevant as far as the project is concerned. Mitch again.
Oh, sorry, just extending my previous question is,
Sure.
Sometimes the profitability within a segment is very different, and you're not aware of the breakup of that. So is there a way to dive down into a set of stat accounts and work that out? Because it may affect the profit.
Okay, so you're saying say if I pick on JB Hi-Fi, JB Hi-Fi's got JB Hi-Fi Australia, JB Hi-Fi New Zealand, and the Good Guys. So is your question, those 3 segments might have different profit margins?
Yeah, and not everyone discloses their segment profitability.
Yeah, you do have to give, if you're ASX listed, you do have to provide segment results. And those segment results will sort of be on segment revenue, segment profit, but it's normally at the EBIT, the earnings before interest and tax level, or a similar level. And the reason for that is that the organizational interest, so the finance costs and the tax measures, are normally done at group level rather than at segment level. So it makes sense to show you EBIT. So you should be able to calculate at least some segment level profitability. And I've kind of been going through, I will pop up kind of later tonight what JB Hi-Fi, or what I've done on JB Hi-Fi. Let me just find the document I was working on, because I've got that for you. So a couple of places that you can look at. The document that you might even want to start at, I know I've got it written down somewhere. Mitch, you were, BlueScope should show you segments. It should be one of the early note disclosures in their financial reports. It should also be, they should also give you segment stuff in the databases as well. So that should be there. Let me just go to one of the documents, and I know we keep talking about, like, you get get your information from the financial statements. If you want to just get an overview of your company, I would advocate for you to go to a results presentation. even before you look at the kind of the annual report. The reason for it is this, is that the results presentation, so it will be called something like an investor presentation, a results presentation. It'll be somewhere in that, typically in the investor relations section. It gets released at the same time as the organization does its earnings announcement. So this came out from JB Hi-Fi a few weeks ago. And the reason why it's important is, or it's useful, is it's a summary of what the management team think are the important bits, not just the financials, but about the business generally. And part of where I was going with this is that if we kind of have a look at kind of a standard kind of ChatGPT describe JB Hi-Fi for us, it'll give you a relatively boilerplate stuff, but you can actually go to, okay, if I go to group model, and certainly for the project, one of the things that you can do is if you think that this is a better description of JB Hi-Fi than you kind of rewriting this, copy this and say, look, this is slide 4 from their recent presentation. This is a summary of the group model, and then do some analysis on that. So don't feel obliged to kind of have to redo this if you think, oh no, this is actually a really helpful slide. This kind of explains the business really nicely. Yeah, use that. That's fine. Again, obviously, if I see something like that, I'll know that it's a JB Hi-Fi slide. So don't try and kind of just copy the graphic and say this is yours, but say, look, this is from their most recent investor presentation. This describes what the group does. So this is JB Hi-Fi. Tells us kind of sort of the 2 main brands, JB Hi-Fi Good Guys, what they're offering, who their target base is. And this one's interesting because the point that JB Hi-Fi make in their earnings calls a lot is that for the young tech-savvy demographic, JB Hi-Fi we saw were captured in consumer discretionary. The point that the CEO, Terry Smart, kind of has made in his last couple of conference calls is that for a lot of this demographic, having the latest electronics toy is more consumer staples rather than consumer discretionary, which is kind of has implications about kind of growth and profitability. So it's not so much discretionary for a lot of it. So the kids have to have the latest iPhone is kind of what he's trying to say. So they've got the group model, group sustainability. Okay, so we've got, on the one hand, here's group performance summarized, but here's their segment performance here without having to go to the half-yearly report. So I can see, on the one hand, sales, I can see EBIT, and he's already calculated EBIT margin for me. As I said, EBIT, you're unlikely to see a net profit figure because interest and tax is not really relevant at a divisional level. So the financing decisions are normally taken at head office level rather than at divisional level. So this level of analysis you should be able to see. You should be able to grab that on FactSet as well. And you'll probably get some segment stuff in the data analysis. Kishal, which
Oh, sorry, that
which
was
idea?
the JB Hi-Fi, like electronics being consumer staple rather than discretionary. I thought it started with iPhone, you know. Like,
yeah. Apple is 100%. Well, Apple is a large part of that. And in the most recent earnings call, that they said that look, I'll kind of scroll down a bit further and show you. They say, look, the key growth categories were communication, so iPhone, audio in terms of headsets. So the what do the Apple call their those buds? What are they called?
AirPods.
Yeah, that's the one. That you can tell I'm an Android person because I don't know what the name of it is. The fitness and accessories, is they said in the conference call, Apple Watch. So yeah, the Apple products was a big part of the key growth categories here, and also part of what he's describing as the customer base that views this more as a staples rather than a discretionary. Yeah, 100%. And certainly if we're thinking about sort of Apple's business strategy is to try and make you think that, well, absolutely, yeah, of course, there's a big difference between iPhone 14 and iPhone 13, and I need iPhone 14. That's, yeah, their marketing division is very good at making that sale. And so, yeah, ChatGPT will give us a kind of a good boilerplate thing, but yeah, actually go to what the company tells us about there. So I said, yeah, if they don't, Mitch, then yeah, it's the segment rules say that you need to report, if you do have different reporting lines, you need to disclose that, and it will either be by business line or it will be by geography. So some organizations will do this by geography. So I'll have kind of Asia Pacific, Americas, Asia, also Asia Pacific, Americas, Europe and rest of world, or whatever it happens to be. So either segment by business line or segment by geography. The idea is that you're meant to do whatever is the most informative.
Yeah, I just looked at mine, and they do it by geography or by global entity, I think.
Yeah.
Global business unit. I was just thinking within the Australian operation, they've actually got multiple industries. So that's why for some reason, I just thought I was focusing on Australia, but they're actually a global business. So
yeah, and look, and that always introduces some nice wrinkles as well.
yeah, I might change my mind now that I've seen this.
That's quite okay. Yeah, people are, yeah. Again, this part of this learning process of working. Okay, let's go have a work out what they do. Okay, Blues. Oh, I didn't realize they did all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. So no, that's all fine. Yeah. I presume you're well familiar with 5 forces. Yeah, we've gone through, you did 5 forces in your strategy? Yeah. Okay, so look, my one sentence, or give me a couple of sentences on 5 forces. What that model is trying to get you to think about, or what I would like to get you to think about when you're using that type 5 forces analysis, is things that impact on the competitiveness of an industry. That's important because the competitiveness of an industry is likely to be reflected in the profitability of an industry. Now, we'll see how that works when we start looking at specific ratios, but in short, the more competitive an industry is, the more profits or the more returns are likely to approach the marginal cost of production in the industry. What would kind of be our economic explanation for that? So another way of saying the same thing is that if an industry is competitive, it's less likely that extremely high or extremely low levels of profitability can be maintained over a long time. So I'll say that again. If industries are competitive, less likely that we'll see really high or really low levels of profitability maintained over time. So what's the economic explanation for that?
Lower prices.
Yeah, so why might there be lower? Why would I be forced to have lower prices?
Because generally someone starts a price war and wants more market share and wants growth through gaining share. And
okay.
often,
yeah. So if there's a competitor in the market that can lower prices, then that's where the price war. So there needs to be the competitor or competitors in there that are able to lower prices. Yep. Or another way of thinking about it is that if we observe really high levels of profitability over time, there's sufficient money sloshing around the capital markets globally now that kind of your private equity folks and your investment bankers and consultants will say, oh, we ought to be able to take a piece of that. Yeah. And we can see, look, Australia's a good example market for that, because in a lot of cases, the number of organizations in any given industry is relatively small, which is why we've seen, I don't know, in grocery retail, and Coles and Woolworths for ages had their 80% market share. That's why Aldi comes in. That's why Costco come in. That's why I think Lidl are planning on coming in as well. Because of it, if we look at the sort of the profitability of Woolworths over time, that's exactly the story there.
So it's just like it attracts more player into the high profit.
Yeah, correct. If we see high levels of profitability, yeah, that attracts more players. And again, obviously and as part of the more competitive the industry is, one of the things is how easy is it for new competitors to come in? Now, retailing, yeah, there's relatively low barriers to entry. It might be higher barriers to entry to come in at the scale of a Coles and Woolworths because they've got the store footprint and the distribution network and so on. But there's no real regulatory burden on sort of setting up a retailer in a way that there might be in, I don't know, setting up an airport or a hospital or something in the a medical equipment manufacturing where there might be some more regulatory burdens there. Yeah, so this is where we're trying to think about what's the overall level of competition and how's that likely to change, because that's going to tell me about potential industry profitability and potential industry growth. Is really what we're talking about. So thinking about those various forces with that lens is probably the way to go. Usually, but not always, I would say the most important of those 5 forces in explaining profitability is going to be the competition among the existing players. Usually, but not always. It will depend on the nature of the industry, but that tends to be the one that people focus on. Yeah. One that you may not have spent so much time on is economics attributes model. Did people look at that in their strategy courses? Yeah, a bit of that. No, there's a few no's, few yeses. Okay, what I'll do, 6:45. What we'll do, let's take 30 seconds to stand up, move about, shake about. Sort of, we've been on for 45 minutes. So, sort of a 1 minute shake around break. Turn your camera off if you need to. Then we'll go through a economics attributes exercise. Okay, so economics attributes. Just do a quick share of the ebook. We're trying to think about it. There's certainly some overlap with what you'd see in a 5 forces and even kind of a cost leadership differentiation type analysis, but it's trying to get you to think about attributes, the impact on the industry and the way that would be reflected in the financial statement. So customers price sensitive or happy to bear price changes? Is demand growing, stable? What's the supply conditions like? Obviously, the 5 forces thinks about the bargaining power of suppliers and manufacturing, capital intensive, people intensity, low tolerance for error or simple. So low tolerance for error means this goes to the amount of quality control. So low tolerance for error, good examples would be, I guess, medical equipment. If I'm making a pacemaker that goes in someone's heart, really low tolerance for error. Another product that we might not think of with low tolerance for error, that's not kind of at the other end of the scale, Lego, funnily enough, has a really low tolerance for error because these bricks all have to click together. So it doesn't have to be expensive to have low tolerance for error. You just need to be focused on that as part of the manufacturing process. How are these things marketed? B2B, B2C, how's the demand created, and what's the likely financing? Just to get a sense of how this might all play out, what I'll do, let's see, I will divide you into, let's go into 3 groups. I'll pop you into 3 groups and I will give you a document that you can just fill out that has, I'll get you to do an economics attribute of JB Hi-Fi. So I'll get you into, if you're in group, let me just get my document links for you. I'll put all these in the chat now and then I'll send them in each group. If you're in group 1, trying to work out if this is going to work. Group 1, you'll go to that document. Group 2, you will go to a slightly different document. This should all take you to group 2 and group 3. These tiny URLs should all take you just to a Google document where I've got a table all spread. Yeah, they are different documents. Okay, so group 1, group 2, group 3. I'll give you a few minutes, so I'll show you what the document looks like now. It's kind of relatively straightforward. This is the group 1 version. Okay, so all I want you to do here is write down. So demand, how you think demand works and so on. And here, how would that be reflected? What do I expect to see in the financial statements? Again, supply. How does that get reflected in the financial statements? Is it manufactured? So the manufacturing process, again, how's that reflected in the financial statements? So that's what that task makes sense. Yep, so I'll give you a few minutes to do that. If that's not making sense, sort of just, yeah, ping me and I'll jump into the groups anyway. I'll give you 1 minute, I'll give you sort of 7, 8-ish minutes for that. Okay, let's do a quick recap. I'm going to start with room 3. So room 3, what did you think about sort of the attribute of demand? How did, quick description of that and how you thought that would play out in the financial statements?
Did you want me to talk? Guys?
Yeah, just quick. Yep.
Yeah.
Quick.
I think we saw I think we saw that the type of gear that JB Hi-Fi sells is discretionary in the average consumer's eyes, and anything that affects the disposable income of a consumer would affect their purchases and therefore would affect JB Hi-Fi's sales potentially.
Yeah, so macroeconomic factors are likely to affect revenue growth as what we could be thinking here. Yep.
Price sensitivity, it would be different between online and in-store, I would say. I think in online's growing as a percentage of total sales for JB Hi-Fi. So, and they talk about risk, price risk in their investor brief, and also I think the director's report, Jeff, I think somewhere in there, or chairman's report, one of those reports talks about risks. And I know they're very concerned about price affecting them as well. And
yeah, and so they've got, it's a combination of to what extent are their customers sort of price sensitive and competitive, and to what extent is there going to be, I guess, price rises coming through from their suppliers, what would be the kind of the other side of things, and that's on the supply side. Yeah, so certainly there's kind of the young consumer, the sort of our digital savvy consumer, the JB Hi-Fi are targeting. They've got their phones out in the store doing a price comparison. And so where does that come through? That comes through in kind of, I guess, the level of what JB Hi-Fi talk about in their briefings as in or on floor discounting. And they're saying that, look, a lot of that kind of disappeared during COVID because there was the supply chain issues. And so in the latest calls that were kind of just had, there was a larger focus on the potential, now that inventory is back in the system, that on floor discounting is likely to creep back towards normal levels, is the way they were describing that. Yeah, group 2, talk to me about supply. And what do we think there?
Oh, I'll go if that's all good.
Yeah, go, Chantal.
Yep. So for supply, we recognise that there are a lot of suppliers or competitors, I suppose, that do sell the same goods as JB Hi-Fi, online as well as in person. And we also did pick up on the fact that people do price match in store. And this would have an impact on the sales on the financial statements. So potentially, so the sales, but also the cost of goods. If there are more cost of goods and also the profit margin. So if there are more suppliers selling the same products, potentially our profit margin might be less at JB Hi-Fi.
Yeah, and profit margins is something that they've been particularly concerned about. And I guess we're also including in this supply bucket as who is supplying, I guess the supply both to JB Hi-Fi and what JB Hi-Fi are doing. And in terms of sort of, JB Hi-Fi, one of the things that makes them attractive, I guess, to a supplier is going to be the fact that they have the large number of customers, particularly in kind of the Australian outlets. So that's going to mean the suppliers, so the big suppliers, so your Apples, your Samsungs and so on, are going to want their products in JB Hi-Fi stores. And because if you're doing a kind of a new product release or a product promotion, JB Hi-Fi is a good place to get in front of a large number of customers. Yeah, manufacturing is kind of one that doesn't really apply so much to JB Hi-Fi.
Sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, sorry, go, Kushal.
So with the supply, so we're not targeting when we like in that analysis, when we talk about supply, we're talking about the availability of similar products in different stores, not necessarily the price competition.
Yeah, so it's thinking about so it's a combination of what are the customers after and who are we competing against. So it's so who's JB Hi-Fi competing against in the market? And so you can say, okay, well, it's a combination of, I guess, in terms of, say, Apple and Samsung, their own direct ones, but also department stores more generally. In terms of the online space, you'd be competing against sort of organizations like Kogan. You're competing against Amazon's. If we sort of branch out if we go sort of strictly away from our communications type products and we go towards the sort of the home appliances, which JB Hi-Fi has moved into in more recent years, that's going to be competing against organizations like Harvey Norman and Bing Lee and so on. So yeah, so what's the nature of the market there look like? So to what extent are they going to be able to kind of extract a price premium, or do they have to match cost cutting and so on? Yeah, Group 1 manufacturing. What do we think?
Yeah, so we mentioned that there's little direct manufacturing that goes on from JB Hi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that they kind of are reliant on a lot of suppliers who have a huge manufacturing component, they're kind of like adjacent to it. So any large impacts around manufacturing can have flow-on impacts more so to things like sales, because if you can't get your phones, then you can't sell phones. So things like that are potentially going to kind of pop up, but they're a little bit more of an indirect sort of linkage.
Yeah,
and they're going to be impacting industry wide as well. So they're more likely to impact the size of the market rather than market share.
Yeah, and I guess of thinking about financial statements rather than property, plant and equipment where we need to have a manufacturing facilities, it's probably going to be shifted more towards inventory costs and therefore cost of goods sold as where that's likely to come through. Yeah, so they won't. Yeah, so we wouldn't expect to see. So I would expect to see, I guess, property, plant and equipment in terms of the retail stores themselves, but not manufacturing equipment as such. If we're thinking about, we had, okay, so this is generally, so marketing, is it B2B or B2C?
B2C.
Yeah,
B2C.
we're targeting consumers, not businesses by and large. Although they do talk about increasing a more sort of corporate kind of consulting type area, but it's a B2C business at the moment.
Would you need to talk about kind of like the interesting thing where JB Hi-Fi has almost got like marketing back the other way, where the suppliers can pay for positioning on the website in more competitive spaces? Like, does that tie in, or do you only need, because it won't appear as on the balance sheet as much?
No, in terms of marketing, that's I guess a combination of marketing and also if we're thinking about like the supply where JB Hi-Fi does have that proposition. I was going to, it's a good point you've raised there, Braden. I was going to jump to, give me 1 second. I was just going to jump to the JB Hi-Fi website just to
Because it relates to marketing, but it's more of a revenue stream incoming than an expense outbound.
Yeah. Okay. So let's have a look at, so JB Hi-Fi, we've got 20% off computers. Okay. We've got Pink's new albums out. We've got some new PlayStation stuff out now. We've got a new MacBook. Now, the things that are coming up on this top splash thing, that's not at random. Samsung is paying for that is contributing to the marketing costs. So this is kind of in the retailing industry, this is kind of what's known as, it will be part of a marketing rebate. So Samsung says to JB Hi-Fi, we've got a new phone coming out. Can we buy a position prominent in your catalog, or can we buy a position that's prominent on your website? And that will in effect reduce JB Hi-Fi's marketing costs. So it's kind of the manufacturer, or the brand here, kicking in towards some of the costs here. So that's one sort of rebate that JB Hi-Fi is able to get, again, because of their size and scope. Yeah, absolutely. So what do we expect to see with B2C generally? We expect to see marketing and advertising as opposed to sales commissions, which is what we might see if we're thinking about a B2B type business. But yeah, rebates are going to be an important part. The other way that JB Hi-Fi can leverage their position as a high volume seller is in a different type of rebates that's based on volume. And so the two sorts of rebates that exist out in retail land, we've got, on the one hand, we've got rebates on the basis, sorry, I just heard my door opening there. I think that could be the storm coming in and adjusting, blowing things about. Rebates on the basis of marketing, and rebates on the basis of volume. And on the volume is, if Samsung says, oh, look, we noticed that you sold 900,000 phones last year. If you sell 1 million this year, we will give you 5% off your purchase price next year. So that's that type of thing. Now, these two sorts of rebates have different implications about where they appear on accounting. I'll come back to this next week. It's where Dick Smith got into kind of trouble, in the sense that they were being naughty. They're incorrectly classifying this. But it is one way that you can get yourself to be a cost leader, is to sort of start driving up volume and getting some discounts on a volume basis, as what you can do there. So you can pass on that to your supplier. But yeah, so absolutely, if we're thinking about the marketing side of things, JB Hi-Fi can offset some of their marketing costs because the manufacturer, or the product suppliers, will kick in. Last item we had there is the financing. Do we expect, and the question that we're asking here is, do we expect to see high or low levels of borrowing on the balance sheet? That's kind of really the question. What's our thoughts here, just generally?
Well, they seem to have a lot of inventory, but they don't seem to have much plant and equipment. So there's not a lot of investing going on.
Yeah, and if we're thinking about, so do we expect them to have a large amount of borrowing, is probably going to be driven by, so if we kind of think about that question, is really going to be, do we expect them to have a large amount of things the lenders would like taking as security, is kind of really what the question is. And so if it's inventory, my concern as a potential lender about their inventory is that, look, if they don't sell it quickly, then it may not be worth that much in the future. So a lot of it is seasonal, or seasonal in the sense that no one's going to buy an iPhone 6 from JB Hi-Fi. So to that extent, the borrowings that they are likely to report, we would expect will be low, probably because they just simply don't have the assets in place that make good security. Whereas other sorts of organizations might have different types of assets that make better security. So before looking at JB Hi-Fi's balance sheet, I'm not expecting a huge amount of kind of interest-bearing debt. But what I will expect, which is kind of equivalent, is if we said before that they rent or lease a lot of their premises, I'm going to expect not only the leased assets, or what they might describe, some organisations describe as a right of use asset, but the matching lease liability or the lease obligation, which is kind of economically similar to a borrowing arrangement. Kishal.
Jeff, what would be the, I mean, we haven't had a recession for a long time, but if there was
Mhm.
there was a change in economic cycle and people stopped buying
Yep.
as many electronics, and the inventory costs went up, and they still have to meet their costs of wages and everything else, then
Mhm.
what else would you see in their financial statements change?
Yeah, so if as part of my forecasting exercise, I take a look at the macroeconomic indicators and I say, yep, recession coming along for sure. What do I think happens? I think demand declines, so sales growth drops, customers become far more price sensitive and probably shift to cheaper products. So there's sales declines, the sales mix changes. They're probably going to have to offer more discounts to get those sales. In terms of their kind of fixed versus variable costs, which is part of what you're talking about, they're relatively flexible with their workforce. So I reckon they could adjust the workforce relatively quickly on that. And their relationships with their suppliers means that they can probably manage the supply chain and kind of as well as anyone in their competitors can. Braden, thoughts?
Mine was a separate question around with the financing component. Like if they're leasing a lot of properties, then they would require bank guarantees for those leases. Bank guarantees are kind of classified as a commercial lending product, but they're very different. How do those appear on financials?
Yeah, so the guarantees, if it's a sort of like typically a third-party guarantee is going to appear. So if it's a subsidiary doing the borrowing, if JB Hi-Fi or one of the groups has signed a lease agreement, that obligation to pay appears as a liability. Let me get up JB Hi-Fi's annual report, and I'll just quickly show you. And we'll speak more about this in detail next week because it's part of our accounting analysis. Down the bottom here on their balance sheet, we can see non-current liabilities is what I'm looking for. Okay, borrowings, they've only got 60 million out of kind of total liabilities of 2 billion. Okay, so low borrowing, but they do have a large amount of lease liabilities, and that's a big line item there. So 300. So what that represents is their obligations to pay under their leasing agreement. So pay the shopping centre owners and so on, who are their landlords. Separate to that, which is what I think your question is they may also be guaranteeing some of these leases. So what we've got here in the balance sheet is their actual financial obligation. So that's what appears. What we may also see if we do a kind of a control S and say, and I can never guarantee AU or UE, I can always get that wrong. There we go. So we've got a deed of cross guarantee, and what that deed of cross guarantee represents is, and this is, it means that if you are lending to any company within the JB Hi-Fi group, all of the kind of the parties named in note 22 with the little X on it. So all of these ones here, well, some, so we've got JB Hi-Fi Pty Limited, all of the ones with that little hat there are part of what's called a deed of cross guarantee. So deed of cross guarantee says that if I lend to JB Hi-Fi Education Solutions and they have some lease obligations or other obligations, every organisation that has the hat, so JB Hi-Fi Limited and everyone else, is acting as guarantor on that loan. So it's a way of making sure that I'm not exposed to the risk of JB Hi-Fi Education Solutions borrowing money and then running away with it, and JB Hi-Fi saying nothing to do with us. So it's the lease obligations are what goes onto the balance sheet. Any other kind of guarantees, if it's not an existing obligation, doesn't appear on the balance sheet. Yeah.
And then do the costs associated with those guarantees, do they come up as a financing expense?
if it's an interest-based charge, so the interest expense or the finance costs on a lease gets included as part of your net interest cost. Yeah, if it's a kind of an admin expense, then that would come kind of further up the income statement under kind of administrative costs.
Cool. It's probably a hyper-specific question. Yeah. Apologies, everyone who doesn't deal with bank guarantees on a daily basis.
Yeah. We'll talk about bank guarantees in more detail next week. Yeah. Yeah, no, because it's the short issue, and I'll kick some of this discussion into next week because it is relevant to next week. The key issue in where it and whether it appears is there an existing obligation? So if the obligation is only triggered by something happening, as in some other party defaults, then that's not a liability because it's not an existing obligation, but it does need to be disclosed in the notes.
Cool. Thank you.
As I said, yeah, can do more on that next week. Look, the last thing actually, I've got 0 seconds now. So if people need to jump off, they can. The last thing I quickly wanted to mention was just doing this sort of thing with ChatGPT. Let me just show you very quickly. If I did, here's conductor 5 forces on JB Hi-Fi, and it does, a relatively okay job. And then I do a 5 forces, and now I've said provide references. I'm going to post this document up in on Moodle, so you can see this in more detail. When I get down and I look for the references, have a look at what the references are. It's not making it bigger. Okay, can we see what those references are?
All the IBIS World ones? They're
all IBIS World 2021, which kind of makes me think, why don't we just go to IBIS World and get the 2022 or 2023. So if we're thinking about, so I guess the short version is don't always kind of take what comes out of ChatGPT as more authoritative than anything else. It looks like it's just picking up stuff from IBIS World. As I said, I've got a kind of a document looking at both ChatGPT and IBIS World, and indeed some of what we're looking at in terms of the JB Hi-Fi stuff itself. I'll post that up kind of now, and I will add to that as we go on during the term. So like where we can piece things together. So I'll throw that up in our JB Hi-Fi section. So next week, what we're talking about is accounting analysis. So in particular, our focus is on thinking about the extent to which the financial statements do a good or a bad job of reflecting the underlying economics. I can see, so anyone that needs to run, have a good week. I will respond to the discussion forum questions that have come on since kind of my reply earlier this afternoon. Kushal, the instructions on data analysis and FactSet, yeah, I will do. I've got a document that I promised that I would upload. I will make a note and I can upload that on how to access data analysis and kind of how to play about with that now. Let me just write that down. Or if you want to stay on and ask anything specific about that, I'll happily, just general. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and also I can do, I've got that or a video on looking at FactSet as well that I will post for both.